national security advisor to President Obama. Ambassador Rice, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you again, Wolf.
The president, you just heard him, he just said a little while ago that if Kim Jong-un does something in Guam, the U.S. territory, it will be an event, in his words, the likes of which nobody has ever seen before. He said that's not a dare, it's a statement of fact. Do you see that as a direct threat?
Well, Wolf, I think we have to be very careful here. The language, the hot rhetoric that we're hearing from both Kim Jong-un and President Trump is itself a challenge, because on the Korean side, the North Korean side, we run the risk that they miscalculate and take the many messages that have been coming in rapid fire from the White House at face value and perhaps miscalculate and act precipitously. On the U.S. side, I think the core of what President Trump said today, discounting for the rhetoric, was if North Korea were to attack the United States, and obviously Guam is part of the United States, we would respond with the full force of our capabilities. That's common sense, that's deterrence, and that's the appropriate approach. What I worry about is this discussion and preparation potentially for what the administration has called preventive war or preemptive war, which would envision the United States potentially attacking North Korea in the absence of an imminent or actual threat against the United States. Deterrence makes good sense. That's very essential for us to maintain, and obviously we don't ever take off the table the threat of the use of force. But preemptive war, if one were actually thinking of executing that, would be catastrophic. Catastrophic for the Korean Peninsula, the over 200,000 Americans that reside there, the 26 million people of metropolitan Seoul, for Japan and the 40,000 American troops stationed there, and for the global economy. We risk a direct confrontation with China, and a conflict could potentially go to the extreme of being nuclear. So a preemptive attack by the United States would be a very, very poor choice, a very dangerous choice. However, maintaining and strengthening our deterrence and making sure the North Koreans understand that if ever they were to use their nuclear weapons against the United States or our allies, they would face annihilation. That's correct.
You wrote today in the New York Times, Ambassador, that you expect the kind of bluster that we're all hearing from North Korea, especially after the United Nations Security Council adopted those new sanctions unanimously. But you added that what is unprecedented and especially dangerous, your words, is the reaction of President Trump. Explain what you mean.
Well, what I said in the article, Wolf, is that, whenever North Korea faces tough sanctions from the United Nations, and I was part of negotiating several such sanctions resolutions, they do react with vitriol and extreme rhetoric. This time it's combined with the annual August exercises where the United States and South Korea are engaged in very significant military exercises on North Korea's doorstep, and they always get very insecure, even more insecure in August. So combine these two things, and we've heard what experts would know to be very predictably hot rhetoric out of Pyongyang. But when the President of the United States makes statements that could be mistaken for Kim Jong-un's, I think that rattles our allies enormously, and it risks a miscalculation, as I said, on the North Korean side. And President Trump's initial threat was tied to not an attack on the United States, which of course we need to be very clear about, but Kim Jong-un making another provocative statement or threat, which is almost inevitable. So we need to be very measured, very careful, very planned in our rhetoric. I hope that we will see more measure out of the administration and out of the president as he approaches this very real challenge.
North Korean officials said earlier today that the U.S., in their words, would suffer a shameful defeat and final doom if it were to persist in extreme military adventure, sanctions, and pressure. Do you think the North Koreans want war? How do you read this?
I read that as rhetoric of the sort we've heard many times before from North Korea. As I said, it may be a little bit hyped up given the convergence of the sanctions in the August exercises. But no, I don't think they want war with the United States. I think Kim Jong-un knows that if he started a war with the United States, it would be at the end of his regime and the end of his country. And that message we need to reinforce, as General Mattis, our Secretary of Defense, did, I think, effectively yesterday. On the other hand, we need to be clear that we are not precipitating something, that we are not ourselves going to be part of destabilizing the situation.
But in addition to the rhetoric, the North Koreans are also now threatening to take specific military action. They say they will launch 4 intermediate-range ballistic missiles over Japan and fly them towards the U.S. territory of Guam and land maybe 10 or 20 miles off the coast of Guam. The president warned that if the North Koreans made any more threats, they would be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. Do you believe the president actually drew a red line?
Well, Wolf, I'm not clear what, and I think the problem is nobody is quite clear what the red line is. Is it a threat from Kim Jong-un? Is it action from Kim Jong-un? Is it missiles flying in the direction of Guam? Or is it an actual attack on the United States or its territories or our allies? I think we got to be very clear about what we are trying to deter and prevent. And I think one of the challenges that we've faced in the last several days is that the bar has been moved in both directions by both the president and some of his spokespersons. So we need to be very clear. Any attack on the United States, our territories, our allies, would be met with the most powerful response, particularly if it involved nuclear weapons.
So if the North Koreans...
But we cannot react, sorry, Wolf, sorry, we just can't react to every statement or verbal provocation that comes out of North Korea.
Well, forget about the statements, but what if they were to launch these 4 missiles into the waters just off the coast of Guam? What should the U.S. do then?
Well, I know that our Pentagon is preparing for that contingency. We have very capable missile defense systems that defend Guam and Hawaii and the United States mainland. And so I don't want to signal what those options might be, but I have confidence that we have responses that are proportionate to the problem.
Well, what would a proportionate response be, hypothetically?
Well, Wolf, that's the whole point. As a former official who's privy to some of this information, I don't think it's responsible for me to get into hypotheticals any more than I would encourage sitting officials to get into hypotheticals. But I think what the American people need to know is that we do have and we continue to refine very advanced missile defense capabilities that protect our territories and protect our homeland. And I have confidence that if in fact there were something that directly threatened the United States territory, that we are in a position to respond and defend ourselves.
You say Kim Jong-un, in your words, is vicious and impetuous, but not irrational. Why do you think that?
Well, I said by most assessments, and by that I mean those that have studied him and his behavior. He is a horrific, hateful person. He's viciously killed members of his family, and he has engaged in behavior that we all would find absolutely intolerable and reprehensible. But he wants to survive. His chief objective is his own personal survival and survival of the North Korean regime. And he has not to date taken actions that put regime survival in jeopardy. An attack on the United States or on our allies using nuclear weapons or massive conventional weapons would obviously provoke the type of response from the United States that he can be certain would end in regime annihilation. And so I do believe, as I argued in the piece today in the New York Times, that while this is nobody's preference and it's a last resort, we do have the ability to manage this problem, not only through sanctions, which we should continue to ratchet up, not only through efforts to undermine the regime, and not only through cooperation with China and others, but we also have the ability to manage this through traditional deterrence, where the North Koreans will understand that should they cross the line of threatening to and attacking and actually attacking the United States or our allies, that they would face overwhelming force. And given the disproportionate strength between the United States and North Korea, that's a very credible threat.
Ambassador, as you know, diplomacy was tried for the 8 years of the Clinton administration, for the 8 years of the George W. Bush administration, for the 8 years of the Obama administration. Diplomacy clearly failed by all accounts. North Korea may right now have as many as 60 nuclear bombs. They may already have the capability of miniaturizing those nuclear bombs, putting them on warheads of intercontinental ballistic missiles that potentially could reach the United States. I want you to listen to what President Trump said today about those earlier failures.
We'll always consider negotiations, but they've been negotiating now for 25 years. Look at Clinton. He folded on the negotiations. He was weak and ineffective. You look what happened with Bush. You look what happened with Obama. Obama, he didn't even want to talk about it. But I talk. It's about time. Somebody has to do it.
You had 8 years. You were the UN ambassador, then the national security advisor to President Obama. You tried very hard to prevent North Korea from developing this nuclear threat. You clearly failed. Why?
Well, Wolf, as you said in your question and in your lead-up, this has been a very, very difficult problem that has now vexed 4 successive American administrations, Democrat and Republican. And each administration has tried not only diplomacy, but increased sanctions and pressure, cooperation with China, and various other methods that we shouldn't speak about on television. And the fact of the matter is that despite all of those efforts, the North Korean regime has been able to succeed in progressing with its program, both nuclear and missile. That's very an unfortunate outcome. You can call it a failure. I accept that characterization of the efforts of the United States over the last 2 decades. But we are where we are, and we now need to decide how to proceed. And what we are facing is a country with nuclear weapons and reportedly now a capability to reach the United States with intercontinental ballistic missiles. What do we do about it? That's the question. And it really boils down to 2 options. One is preventive war or preemptive war, which I argue would be absolutely foolish and catastrophic. The other is to maintain and increase the pressure on North Korea, can leave open the door to diplomacy, refine our military capacities, build up our missile defenses for ourselves and our allies, while at the same time recognizing that we can, in all likelihood, safely rely on deterrence to prevent a catastrophic event unless we manage it in carefully. So I think we have a very serious national security challenge. I argue that this need not be a crisis if we manage this carefully, and I hope, but I frankly worry, given some of the mixed messages coming out of the administration, that we can manage this carefully and responsibly, protecting the United States, protecting our allies, containing the threat that North Korea poses, and leaving open the door with pressure, sanctions, and diplomacy to resolve it over time.
There's something rather intriguing that jumped out at me from your article that you wrote in the New York Times today, and I'll read it because I want you to explain. The same red line must apply to any proof that North Korea has transferred nuclear weapons to another state or non-state actor. Does that mean, Ambassador, that North Korea might be selling nuclear bombs to other nations or terrorist organizations in order to make money?
I'm not saying that has happened. I'm saying we can't allow that to happen. So we have 2 parallel and very important challenges. One, as we've been discussing at some length, is making sure that North Korea would never dare, because it would understand that it would suffer incalculable defeat, to attack the United States or our allies using nuclear weapons. The other challenge is to ensure that North Korea isn't foolish enough to try to proliferate its nuclear weapons, i.e. sell or transfer those weapons to a third party, whether that be a state or a non-state actor. And so I don't want to suggest that that has happened. I do want to suggest that we have been, for many decades, concerned about the proliferation potential, and we need to ensure that we are very clear in deterring that as well as a potential attack.
Because you remember the North Koreans did help the Syrians build their nuclear reactor, the nuclear reactor that the Israelis eventually bombed. Is that right?
Yes, Wolf, you're right in recalling that.
All right.
But that was not transfer of weapons, that was transfer of technology, which was also very concerning, and I think the Israelis acted in their national interest to resolve that issue.
Ambassador, the President's National Security Advisor, General McMaster, he just renewed your security clearances. He's getting some grief for this from some of the right-wing media. I want you to react to that.
Well, General McMaster, according to the White House statement, renewed the security clearances of all of his predecessors, his national security advisors, and all the former presidents, living presidents of the United States. That is customary to do when a new administration comes in, and every prior administration has done the same for its predecessors. So I think this is really, unfortunately, an opportunity and an excuse for those who are now quite unfairly, in my judgment, attacking General McMaster to make an issue where there really isn't one.
Has he consulted with you? Have you been in touch with him?
Wolf, I think I'd rather not answer that. I think let us just say that it's customary for sitting national security advisors, I know this from my own experience, to be in touch with their predecessors, to understand what challenges and issues they wrestled with, what options they considered. And so I imagine that General McMaster will from time to time consult his predecessors.
Ambassador Susan Rice, thanks so much for joining us. Deeply appreciate it.
Good to be with you again. Take care.
Thank you. Just ahead, President Trump.